Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Yusuf Aram. Moscow is accusing Kiev of sabotaging the peace process after blaming it for a string of attacks on Russian-linked tankers in the Black Sea. Ukraine has denied any involvement. Some of the vessels were reportedly hit in waters that fall under Turkey's maritime jurisdiction. Turkish officials warned the strikes endanger navigational safety and risk pulling the region into deeper conflict. The attacks took place over the past week near and inside Turkey's exclusive economic zone. One tanker bound for Georgia was struck on Tuesday, roughly 130 kilometers off the Turkish coast near Sinop. Earlier strikes targeted vessels further west. Those attacks and the broader question of Black Sea security came up in Brussels on Wednesday, where Turkey's Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan met NATO's incoming Secretary General Mark Rutte. Their talks focused on preventing the conflict from spilling into regional waters. Since the start of the war, Turkey has played a central role in maintaining maritime stability. Meanwhile, Washington is advancing a new peace plan, but the Kremlin says several key elements are unacceptable. On the ground, Kiev is fighting to hold the line, while Russia claims new gains in Ukraine's east. For more, joining me now from Perth, Australia, is Alexei Muraviv. He's an associate professor at Curtin University. From Lefkosia, the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, Asel Tutumlu, an associate professor at Near East University. And from Dhaka, Bangladesh, Greg Simmons, a Daffodil International University professor. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining me. I mean, we are well past 3 years with what's been going on in Ukraine, and it doesn't seem like we're any closer to peace, or are we? I think that's one of the things we're going to examine. But over the past couple of weeks, there's been an escalation of tensions, especially in the Black Sea. And I want to begin with this. Alexei, when you're looking at what's happening in the Black Sea, how dangerous is it and how far back is this pulling us away from peace?
Well, strategically, it's not going to be a game changer with regards to combat that is taking place between the Russians and the Ukrainians. It's certainly yet another form of escalation. The first thing that comes to my mind is comparisons between this war and the Iran-Iraq war of 1980-1988, when battlefield action gradually transformed into war of the cities, into Scud missile attacks, into chemical warfare. Fortunately, we haven't seen any the later on the battlefields of Ukraine, as well as the tanker war. So now we're entering the phase of the tanker war, attacks on offshore infrastructure, and as well as maritime-based supply chains. But just like with the war between the Iranians and the Iraqis, it didn't have too much of an effect on the outcomes of the war, though it drew in international attention and international involvement. So far, we obviously haven't seen any international reaction apart from limited reaction coming from both sides involved in the conflict, as well as the reaction of the Turkish president. But as far as follow-on action, it depends whether this escalation pattern will continue to climb or whether there's going to be a scaling down of adversarial action, particularly in the maritime domain.
Mm-hmm. Asel, I want to ask you, how concerned should the Turks be? I mean, it looks like a couple of these strikes took place in Turkey's exclusive economic zone inside of their maritime jurisdiction. How much does this hamper trade?
I think that it's a really serious escalation, and it potentially can undermine several interests in charge. So Black Sea, and particularly the strikes in territorial waters of Türkiye, is a very dangerous precedent, and it hasn't been. It doesn't mean that it war. I mean, several strikes on the vessels. Most of them happened in the northern part of the Black Sea, but with this, we actually see the real kind of expansion of threats. And Black Sea right now is a very important corridor for not only just Turkey and the trade, but also for Central Asian countries, Caucasus, China, and the European Union. As a result of that, I think it has a potential to it has a potential to undermine the growing importance of the middle corridor, and also potentially expand the front line, so to say, to more countries involved, particularly that are adjacent to the in the Black Sea, and that's, I think, very natural that having done that to talk to Romania and Bulgaria, and also the NATO states, because I think Turkey assesses the potential risks of impeding trading corridors as a very serious threat.
Greg, I want to ask you a little about the grain corridor deal. I mean, during the corridor deal, while it was humanitarian and for grain, obviously there was a security dimension to it, a much calmer Black Sea during that period. Would you want to see both sides go back to the grain corridor deal? Or outside of the grain corridor deal, do you expect this escalation in the Black Sea, at least from the maritime perspective, to continue and escalate even further?
I think it would be ideal if they did go back to this grain deal type corridor, but I think it is unlikely. As Alexei said, it's unlikely to affect the battlefield in terms of the relations of power, but this is intended to alter the relations in terms of political relations. I think I think that escalation will happen because Ukraine is on the back foot, and not only on the battlefield, but politically, because they could see Trump perhaps doing a deal without necessarily Ukraine and the Europeans who are supporting Ukraine. So this is an act of somewhat desperation. If they get a disproportionate response, perhaps they can drag other countries into it. But what we see is, for example, Romania took out one of these Ukrainian maritime drones recently. So this shows that it's not only a concern for Russia, for Turkey, but other countries of the Black Sea, as has already been suggested, that this escalation stands be a risk for not only Turkey and Russia.
Mm-hmm. So, Alexei, Greg is saying this is kind of like a last-ditch effort to create some type of chaos in the Black Sea. I mean, do you think Ukraine has anything to gain from this from a diplomatic perspective? Can they create some leverage over Moscow? What exactly do you think is Zelensky's endgame here?
Look, I think the Ukrainians have been running since they have lost strategic initiative on the ground. They have been running their kind of contingency planning on the grounds. They just need to extend their struggle, their defense of Ukraine to the point when it would break Russia's will, which in my view is unachievable. I think it's an awfully optimistic scenario, but nonetheless, the Ukrainians believe that somehow they can demonstrate to their Western supporters that they haven't given up, that they still have cards that they can pull out, even though they're not going to make any strategic effect, but they can create nonetheless media effect. And I think in a situation when one side chooses asymmetric means of conducting warfare, it's the media effect that seems to be one of the key drivers behind the rationalizing that particular act. Also, given the fact that there is a degree of ambiguity concerning the way how different sides interpret these actions. The Russians came out and spoken unequivocally of the way how they look at this, saying it's an act of piracy. Whilst obviously Ukraine's Western alliance would probably give Kiev, and that's perhaps also behind Kiev's thinking, a degree of lenience, saying, well, it's an act of self-defense, it's not exactly piracy, it's not exactly maritime terrorism or some sort of an unlawful act. As a result, Ukraine has the right to defend itself. The problem arises, and again, I would probably want to still keep it within the parameters which I identified in the first part of my response. For now, it's not a situation when we talk about serious escalation. Where the escalation can occur is if Ukraine's Western alliance will start taking a different look at this, treating it as similarly to the way how the Russians describe it, as an act of piracy, when they would start looking at it as an act where Ukraine went too far, or if Ukraine would extend this sort of operations to other maritime theaters. Again, the problem with asymmetric, employing asymmetric means, like, for example, uncrewed maritime drones, they don't have to be confined to a particular maritime theater, in this particular case, the Black Sea. They can be easily transported to the Baltic. They can even be employed in the Mediterranean. And by that, you can actually extend the sphere of armed struggle to more than one isolated theater. And that it would obviously cause escalation, because it could create destabilizing effect for more than just one supply chain that goes through the Black Sea, Mediterranean strategic link. If the Baltic will start being affected, in the Mediterranean will start being affected, or if it would be done in combination with other acts similar to the attack on Nord Stream pipeline, then you can start seeing a degree of bigger problem arising.
Aside from Russia and Ukraine, there's a trio of NATO members who also have coastlines in the Black Sea. You have the Romanians, Bulgaria, and the Turks. Now, obviously, they all want to protect their exclusive economic zones and their jurisdictions. Do you see NATO getting more involved in what's happening in the Black Sea, or do you see these three members moving forward on their own, or together? They had some type of trilateral mechanism, obviously, in place at the beginning of the war, where they had met multiple times. So how do you see these three members protecting their own maritime jurisdiction?
Well, right now, for example, I don't really foresee NATO being involved per se. It really depends how these specific strikes will be interpreted. So on the one hand, we can actually showcase these strikes as kind of preventive signaling to countries that are engaged in parallel imports. And we know that Central Asia, for example, Türkiye, these are the countries that are very much continuing, to trade. And for UK, it's basically a support of an enemy. And so if this interpretation dominates the scheme, then NATO is probably not going to be involved. And here I agree with Alexei that it's going to be seen as a legitimate target. However, we can also see that there are several very important agreements that have been taking place on delivering gas and fuel to Ukraine through the port Odessa, and which makes these agreements very fragile. Russia understands it, and it continues to bomb basically Ukrainian infrastructure, which makes the support of Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey crucial in here, because of the population that's already experiencing over 15 hours of no electricity per day. So the crucial deal, for example, that was signed with Greece on November 16th, that promised LNG delivery to Ukraine, now can be potentially jeopardized. LNG comes from the United States, or at least promised. So as a result of all of this, we can see that all of these countries have the potential interest in maintaining the peaceful sea, and also delivering the necessary support for Ukrainian population, and continuing with the corridors and pipeline systems, which can be under threat should these particular strikes continue.
I want to move forward to take a look at the diplomacy that's happening behind the scenes and also in front of the cameras. Greg, obviously, U.S. President Trump has invested a lot during his campaign and in the first year of his presidency, trying to establish a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. Where do you see Trump at right now? I mean, is he any closer than he was the day he took office? Are Are Putin and Zelensky any closer to actually sitting down across from each other and having a discussion?
I don't think there is any room for civil discussions between the parties. And I think Trump understands this. And you can see, for example, when the 28-point peace plan came, you had the use of Nabu to take these supporters out from around Zelensky, these key people that were keeping him in power. So this is no coincidence. This happens at the same time. And Trump, of course, is not necessarily only about American interests. He's about his image. And I think he understands that Ukraine is a lost cause militarily by now. And he does not want to be seen as a Biden when he left Afghanistan in that ramshackle state, because he divides the world between winners and losers. So Ukraine and Zelensky have become a geopolitical liability by this stage, and it stops him from pursuing his main interest, which is geopolitical and geoeconomic rivalry with China, which is the principal contester of US global hegemony.
Mm-hmm. I think, Greg, you touched on an important thing there with Trump and his image. Alexa, I want to ask you about Putin and Zelensky and their respective images, especially regarding a peace deal and what it would look like. I mean, obviously, both sides wants to look like the winner coming out of either peace deal, and looking like the loser will obviously have some domestic impact for either or, whichever one looks like a loser or at least didn't get the win. How much do you think that is playing into the calculations of Ukraine and Russia, especially with Putin thinking, I need to look like the winner, or Zelensky thinking, if I look like the loser, will I be able to continue in a post-war scenario as the president of Ukraine?
Well, this is probably one of the sticking points that prevent the two sides plus the United States from moving forward and reaching an outcome. Obviously, when it comes to negotiating a peace in a wartime situation, unless you're talking about a categorical defeat of one side by the other side, it's the art of compromise that allows the two parties to eventually cease hostilities and come to some sort of an agreement. I think one of the key missing points in all the conversations surrounding these ongoing conversations concerning possible peace settlement is quite often media portrays both Ukraine and Russia as almost like equal parties. And then they start discussing the issue, well, how come the Ukrainians have to give in something whilst the Russians are not asked to give up, to give in much? The problem is, obviously, we're talking about two players which have different strategic weight, that have different situation concerning the conduct of the war and the gains that have already been made. And as a result, we're obviously talking about the two national leaders with different senses of comfort. Putin feels far more comfortable and more confident about imposing his will upon the conduct, not just of the war, but also on the conduct of negotiations. He can actually go out and say to media, the 28-point peace plan is not actually a 28-point peace plan, but rather than a set of discussion points that him and Trump agreed to carry on in conversations in Anchorage, in Alaska. Zelensky has no capacity to say something like that, and certainly after the eruption of this ongoing corruption scandal, which really starts zooming onto himself and not just his immediate political neighborhood, he's finding himself in a really more exposed position than before. When you have constant reshuffling of your cabinet, when you had changes to defense ministers during wartime, it ain't looking good. When you start having people within your political spectrum questioning the political future of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief at the time when the nation needs to demonstrate unity, internally as well as externally, it ain't looking good. The fact that Ukraine has just adopted the draft of the budget with a massive deficit, with an expectation that somehow that deficit of nearly $50 billion will somehow be covered by Western sponsors. Well, that's a set of strategic vulnerabilities that doesn't allow Zelensky to say much behind closed doors, because we need to differentiate what people say on camera in public and what is actually going on in private behind closed doors.
Asad, when we look at the dialogue between the Turks and the Americans, I mean, the volume, the frequency between Erdogan and Trump, between Fidan and Rubio, probably at an all-time high as it's been over the past year. I mean, you have Gaza, you have Syria, you have Ukraine, and you have the bilateral agenda as well. So going forward, I mean, what type of cooperation are you expecting to see between the Turks and the Americans? And how much does Trump need Erdogan to be able to secure peace in Ukraine?
Well, I think American support is definitely vital here. And what I see is a slow shift of Turkey coming from very strong, supportive Russia relations with Russia into a much more active involvement and engagement of the United States, knowing that basically the peace will depend on the support of the United States. And that overly strong, for example, Russia, that can potentially control the larger parts of the Black Sea is not good for none of the actors nearby, none of the littoral states. And so there is a shift indeed towards the United States for various things. I already talked about LNG cooperation. There is also the potential for the U.S. stronger involvement in maintaining and expanding the Middle Corridor, with Zangezur Corridor being under U.S. protection. And overall, U.S. is needed to really kind of support strategic vulnerabilities of states against stronger Russian involvement, and Turkey understands it, and we can see it also in economic statistics, where Turkey is trying to decrease, for example, reliance on Russian oil and gas. It's still a formidable percentage points, but so for example, it's 47% versus 57% last year. But nonetheless, there is indeed a very strong desire to really distance the economic dependence from Russia and really concentrate on establishing alternative corridors and a secure, peaceful environment where the United States is definitely vital.
Mm-hmm. Greg, I want to ask you, since the beginning of the war, there's been a lot of pressure inside of NATO and inside the Western camp on countries like Turkey and Hungary to not play a balanced role and kind of come back into the fold and cut off their relationship with the Russians. When you look back at the past 3 years, do you see value that there have been a couple of NATO members who have kept the channels of dialogue open? And do you expect that dialogue to play an important role going forward?
Absolutely. The EU under von der Leyen has been an utter disaster. And what she has done under her so-called leadership is make the EU irrelevant in such matters as Ukraine, which is why Trump does not have anything to do with the Europeans. They're excluded because of their, I think, arrogance and lack of strategic sense. And so Turkey and Hungary, I mean, they're playing a much smarter game, because just to choose one side over another because of some kind of emotional feelings or some kind of ideological projections do not work. And I think this puts Turkey and Hungary in a much stronger position. For example, if we look that Hungary got that exemption with the energy supplies, and it keeps both sides open. And as I said, the EU has made itself absolutely irrelevant and the laughingstock
Alexei, Asa, Greg, I want to thank you for your commentary, but unfortunately, we are out of time for today. And that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Yusuf Aram. If you got any comments, please share them with us on X at Straight Talk TRT. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can find more exclusive content. Until next time, take care and goodbye.